Okay, here's the second installment on the video lecture series for my Upward Bound students at West Virginia State University, summer 2015. Now, we covered algorithms. That was the last thing that I talked about in the last video. Now I want to talk to you about heuristics. These are the most entertaining problem-solving approaches to discuss. I'm going to give you three types. A definition of a heuristic. A heuristic is simply a mental shortcut or a general rule of thumb that we use to solve problems. Again, a heuristic is a general rule of thumb or a mental shortcut that we use to solve problems. Now, there are three types of heuristics, and these will probably not be in your book, so you want to make sure that you have these down and in your notes. Three types of mental shortcuts that we take to solve problems. The first one is the representative heuristic. I'm going to talk about it first. Next, we'll talk about the availability heuristic, and last, the adjustment heuristic. So, oops, didn't mean to do that. Now, let's start with the first one, the representative heuristic. This is essentially the same thing as stereotyping. It means exactly the same thing. It's easier, and I'm going to point you to the picture here at the top. Be mindful about stereotypes. Only one of them is a convicted felon. You would look at this, and a lot of people would assume that the black man is the felon because we stereotype black men in our society as being aggressive and being, being drug dealers and being in jail and being convicted felons, drug dealers, whatever. And certainly that is not true for every black man in this country. And we would assume that the white girl with the pretty little shirt baking a cake is probably not going to be a felon. But if you know this is Martha Stewart, you know probably that she is a convicted felon. And you might be surprised to know that Snoop Dogg is not a convicted felon. But stereotypes come into play. It's easier for me to look at you, hypothetically, say that, I'll use myself, it might be better, as an example. Now, the representative heuristic and stereotyping are the same thing. So write this definition down, and I'll tell you this story. If I walked into your classroom and you didn't know me and you had never met me, and I was wearing blue jeans, a cowboy hat, a belt buckle with my name on it, a flannel shirt, and I had a spit cup in my hand, and I sat down in front of you and said something to the effect of, "Howdy, y'all," what else would you assume to be true about me? Would you take time to get to know me, or would you just assume other things about me? Probably a lot of you would make other assumptions. You might assume that I like country music, and that I probably am a racist, and that I probably have a rebel flag flying in the back of my truck with a gun rack with mud flaps, and that I like to hunt, and that I like NASCAR, blah blah, etc., etc. These are stereotypes. Is it possible with that image of me that you have walking into your classroom that I could be a florist or a hairstylist or a rapper? Maybe. You never know. If you take the time to get to know me, maybe you figure out that I'm not going to fit this stereotype. But a lot of us make this mistake. We assume all black people are dangerous or drug dealers, which is ridiculous. We assume that all cheerleaders are loose with their morals. That's a stereotype. Or we assume that all athletes are jerks and womanizers. Again, these are all stereotypes. It's not fair to make those assumptions. So you have your definition of stereotype. Certainly, again, we look at if we were in class, I would put these images up and we would talk about them. I would ask you, what do you assume to be true about this guy? I think I just listed off a lot of that here just a second ago. What are his interests? What kind of music does he listen to? How does he treat women? How intelligent is he? How educated is he? Does he have a job? If so, what kind of job does this guy have? Is it going to be different than this guy right here? What's this guy like? Is he good with girls? Is he popular? Is he smart? What kind of music does he like? Does he play sports? You think this guy's athletic right here? Again, we have stereotypical ideas that go with these images. What do we assume? I'm going to pick and choose here for time purposes. What do we assume to be true about this guy right here? I always ask this question in my class. I put this image up, and I get answers typically like, well, he's been in prison, or he's a rapper, or he's a convicted felon, or he has 8 kids by 8 different women. And these are all, unfortunately, stereotypes. And stereotypes are often not pleasant. They're not often positively connotated, as you can see. I asked the same question about the male athletes in high school. What do we assume to be true? Are they smart? Do they treat women well? Do they make good grades? What about these guys right here? I think the emo subculture may be dying out, but we assume certain things about people based on their appearance. Now I'm going to go back here. I went too far. Now, that's the representative heuristic. It's essentially stereotyping. It's easier to decide things about you based on your appearance than it is to make decisions about you after taking a lot of time to get to know you. Okay. Now, second, the availability heuristic. Very simply by definition, write this down. The availability heuristic suggests that we make decisions about things based upon how many examples we have available to us. Now I'll explain that, okay? Again, the availability heuristic refers to making decisions about things based on how many examples we have available to us. I'll give you an example. Very quickly, if I ask you the question, and don't think about it too much, but just answer it to yourself real quick. Is there more school violence today than there was in the 1950s in this country? A quick response, most students would say, well, yeah, there's more school violence today than there was in the 50s. And the answer is actually no. There was more school violence in the 50s. And you think, well, how is that possible? Well, you make decisions about things based upon how many examples you have in your head. The media saturates us with every single story of every single thing, little and huge, that happens in every public school in this country in terms of violence. We hear about the horrible things like that happened in Paducah, Kentucky, or Columbine in Colorado. Most recently, there have been some other problems with school violence in essentially every state. And the media replays it for us constantly, so we can relate to that. In the 50s, there was a ton of school violence, but it just never got reported. You never heard about it because it wasn't seen as being as big a deal, and the media and the internet weren't putting it out there for us to see and hear about constantly. Last, the adjustment heuristic. Very simply by definition, the adjustment heuristic refers to our tendency to make a decision about something, realize it's a bad decision kind of halfway through, and then stubbornly sticking with the decision anyway. It should be called the maladjustment heuristic. Again, the adjustment heuristic is stubbornly making a decision, realizing it's a bad decision, and then sticking with it anyway. Let me give you a great example. I would ask the question in class, how many of you have ever been to a movie theater? You go see a movie, you think it's going to be great, you spend $100 on tickets and popcorn, unless you're like me and you go to the dollar store and you buy a bunch of cheap crap and you put it in a big bag or your wife's purse and you sneak it into the theater to save money. But that's another topic for another day. You get into the movie theater, you've invested time and money in this movie. You get about halfway through and you realize it's a terrible movie. It's just awful. There's no saving it. Now, assuming that you're not going to get up and sneak into another movie halfway through, are you going to sit there and watch it since you've invested so much time and money in it, or are you just going to get up and leave? Most of us would sit through it because we've already started it. You could say the same for a TV show if you're watching. You get halfway through, it's terrible. You're like, well, there's only a half hour left. I've already watched 30 minutes. I might as well finish it. Now, on a more serious psychological note, with the adjustment heuristic, a lot of times you see this with domestic violence, especially victims, and more specifically, female victims of domestic violence. The question is often asked, why don't you leave? If you're in an abusive relationship and you know it's a terrible relationship, why not get out? Well, same thing. Victims have invested, especially women, girlfriends, wives, have invested so much time with their partner. Maybe they have kids with these men. They love their husbands and boyfriends. They have homes. They have bills. They've invested so much they don't want to just give it up, so they think, well, I'll just stick it out. It'll get better. Or I've already put so much time and effort into it, I'm just going to ride it out to the end. And the abuse continues. So on all of us succumb to these heuristics at one time or another. So those are the three major types of heuristics. So I will scoot ahead to the last type of learning, which is observational learning. So this won't take long. So we've covered cognitive learning in the last video and a half. Now the last major type, very simply, is learning that is acquired by watching others or observing other people. This type of learning can occur without reinforcement, without punishment. It's not instinctive, and you're not necessarily even thinking your way through a problem. You just learn by watching. How many of you have learned something just by watching someone else? Maybe if you have a job, you've learned or you've shadowed a person to figure out how to do the job. You've watched students ask questions or make mistakes in class with the teacher, and you think, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to make that mistake. Observational learning. If you play sports, you've probably watched someone who plays your position, or you've watched a coach show you how to execute a move or a specific athletic endeavor. You watch that coach and then you learn how to do it. That's observational learning. Now there was a classic study by Albert Bandura in the 1960s. It's called the Bobo doll study. And you have to remember, during the 1950s and 60s, television hadn't been around all that long. And what television was showing was a lot of violence. Westerns were very violent. Gunfire, murdering, killing. And people started to worry, especially adults, started to worry that kids who are watching violent TV are also going to become violent. They're going to become desensitized, they're going to think this is normal, and they're going to go out and they're going to become violent and aggressive people. Well, Bandura thought, well, I'm going to put a study together. Let's just see kind of how this works. And essentially what he found, I moved ahead too quickly, sorry. He took kids, put them in a laboratory setting, divided them into two groups, and the first group of kids were to observe adults interacting with this Bobo doll. Now, a Bobo doll is and I had one when I was a kid. They were great. You would actually inflate them, and there was a big weight on the bottom of it that you kind of see. You could kick it, you could punch it, it would like fall down, but it would always pop right back up. It was a great toy. Hours of entertainment. Now, the first group of kids watched adults interact with the Bobo doll in a very aggressive way. The adults were kicking it, beating it, punching it. And then the kids were led into the room. They were given no instructions. They weren't told that they had to abuse the doll. And Bandura wanted to see what these kids would do. Guess what? They kicked it, they beat it, they punched it. They did essentially what they saw the adults do. Now, in the second group, it was a little different. These kids observed the adults interacting with the doll in an appropriate way, in a positive way. The adults were not abusing it, they were not kicking the doll, they were not punching it. And then when the children in this group were allowed subsequently to enter the room and interact with the doll, most of these children did not punch it, did not kick it, did not beat the crap out of it. They basically did what they saw the adults doing. So the idea was that, okay, maybe this study does show, for better or for worse, that children are going to have a tendency to repeat behaviors that they see in adults. Now, the problem with this study is that this was a laboratory study. It may or may not generalize to the real world, but it did shed some light on the idea that children kind of do what they see adults doing, for better or for worse, especially at young ages. Now, near the end here, the last slides, 4 parts to observational learning. Attention. Write these down, have these in your notes. The extent to which we pay attention to the behaviors of others around us is important. If you don't pay attention to what you're being taught, you're not gonna learn it. Second of all, retention. This is our ability to remember what we see others doing. I may pay attention to what you're showing me, but if I don't remember it, I'm not going to be able to demonstrate the learning. The third is called the production process. If someone's trying to show me how to throw a football or to throw a softball, I might pay attention to the coach. I might be able to retain or remember how to throw the ball, but I may not be able to do it myself. And then motivation. If I'm not motivated to do it, it's not going to matter. How many professional athletes fizzle out because they're not motivated to play? They get a big paycheck, or they get their contract extended. They get money, and then they're like, I don't want to play anymore. I can pay attention. I can remember how to do it. I could actually do it physically, but I just don't want to do it. All 4 pieces have to be in place for observational learning to occur. And that is it for the video lectures on learning. Thank you very much.